At 8,000 feet in the central Rockies, winter didn't just arrive, it took over. The old trappers used to say the cold in that country could bite through elk hide, and they weren't exaggerating. Storms rolled off the Wind River Range with no warning, dropping temperatures 30 degrees in a single afternoon. Snow settled into the draws and hollows and never melted until spring. Anyone who lived up there knew one simple truth: if your cabin wasn't built right, by the first freeze, the mountain would teach you exactly what you did wrong. During the early 1800s, most frontier cabins followed the same pattern. They were thrown together quickly, usually in less than 2 weeks, because settlers were racing the weather. A few felled pines, a simple stick floor, rough chinking, and whatever stove they could afford or drag up from the settlements, that was the standard formula. For many families, it was good enough. For anyone living at high elevation, it wasn't even close. That winter, the cold hit harder than expected. Water buckets froze inside cabins, even with fires going. Timber walls wept moisture that turned to ice sheets before sunrise. Men and women woke up stiff with their blankets rimmed in frost. Several cabins in the valley took on the smell of wet wool and smoke, a sign that things were not working.
Barely enough to last the week.
People burned more firewood in a month than they planned to use all season, and still couldn't stay warm. But one cabin stood out. Its builder, Elias Turner, a 54-year-old mountain man with nearly 3 decades of off-grid living behind him, had quietly done something different. While his neighbors repeated the same old frontier formula, Elias relied on techniques he remembered from European immigrants he'd worked with years earlier. He didn't say much about it at the time, and most people assumed his cabin would end up just as cold as theirs. But by late November, a rumor started spreading Elias's place stayed noticeably warmer. Often by nearly 30 degrees, even though he burned far less wood than anyone else. Word traveled quickly in a small valley. Folks passing by saw almost no smoke coming from his chimney, even on the coldest morning. Yet whenever Elias opened his door, you could see warm air spill out like steam from a bathhouse. It didn't make sense to anyone. People chalked it up to luck, or better timber, or maybe an unusually good stove. But none of those guesses were right. The truth was simpler and stranger. Elias had used a building trick most settlers hadn't heard of and wouldn't have trusted even if they had. And it didn't involve a fancy stove, expensive tools, or rare materials. It involved the walls themselves. Before the season was over, that trick would turn his cabin into the warmest shelter in the entire valley and force his neighbors to rethink everything they believed about cold weather building on the American frontier. Most mountain men learned their building skills on the fly, whatever they picked up from neighbors' army manuals or whoever had been in the territory a few months longer than they had. Elias Turner was different. Long before he trapped beaver or scouted timber lines, he spent his teenage years working alongside a quiet Austrian mason named Johann Weiss, a recent immigrant who settled near Elias's family in central Pennsylvania. Johann didn't talk much, but he built things that lasted. He specialized in thick earthen stoves, clay-plastered walls, and heat-holding masonry known in Europe as kachelofen. To most Americans at the time, these structures looked heavy and unnecessary, far too permanent for people who expected to move every few years. But Elias paid attention. He watched how Johann mixed clay and sand until the texture reached a perfect firmness. He watched how the man used stone not for decoration, but to store heat, keeping rooms warm long after the fire went out. Elias didn't realize it then, but those lessons would become the difference between a warm cabin and a dangerous one decades later in Wyoming. By the early 1830s, Elias was deep into mountain life. He trapped through the Tetons guided surveyors for short seasons and lived among Shoshone and Crow families who taught him how to read weather-managed smoke and build shelters that didn't waste heat. From them, he learned the importance of sealing drafts, a concept many settlers ignored. From Johann, He learned how different materials respond to fire and cold. Most men on the frontier believed that wood was the king of all building materials. It was everywhere easy to shape quick, to stack, and lighter than stone. But it had one major weakness: it couldn't hold heat. Elias had seen European houses stay warm with only a small fire because their walls acted like giant batteries storing warmth and releasing it slowly. He never forgot that. When he arrived in the Wind River Valley, he noticed something immediately. Every cabin was built nearly identical. Same loose chinking, same drafty floors, same thin plank walls,
Heat loss.
same iron stove in a corner. It was fast, familiar, and easy, but it had no staying power in real mountain cold. Elias knew better. He didn't lecture anyone because he'd learned early on that frontier communities didn't care for book knowledge or foreign ideas. But he also knew that if he built his own cabin exactly the same way everyone else did, he'd end up fighting the same losing battle against the cold. So he quietly incorporated the forgotten techniques he'd carried with him since boyhood, mixing clay until the consistency was right, selecting stones that wouldn't crack under heat, and thinking about the cabin not as a wooden box, but as a system. A system that could gather heat, hold it, and release it evenly. To his neighbors, Elias was just another mountain man with a few odd habits. To anyone who understood the old world craft he carried, it was clear he was building something very few American settlers had ever seen. By late summer, Elias Turner had finished most of his cabin, the same way everyone else did. Squared logs, a tight roof, a small iron stove he'd hauled up the trail the year before. At a glance, nothing about it looked unusual. But once the basic structure was done, Elias started working on something that caught the attention of every passerby on the trail. He began coating the inside walls of his cabin with clay. To most frontier settlers, it looked ridiculous. People used clay for chinking gaps between logs, sure, but spreading it across entire walls. That wasn't just unconventional. It looked pointless. Some even called it dangerous. Word spread fast, and soon enough, neighbors were stopping by just to watch him press handfuls of wet clay sand and chopped grass directly onto the log surfaces. "Turner's mudding his walls," one man joked. "He building a root cellar or a cabin," another laughed. Someone else added, "Looks like he's planning to live underground." No one bothered to ask why he was doing it. They assumed they already knew the answer. He didn't know any better. In a community where everyone built the same way, anything different was immediately judged as wrong. That was the frontier mindset: fast work, familiar methods, and no patience for experiments. The cabin building guides of the era reinforced that thinking. Government pamphlets and homesteader manuals all repeated the same instructions: use timber build, quick, keep things simple. People trusted these methods because they'd seen them used in a dozen settlements before. They believed a thick log wall was all the insulation a person needed. The real misunderstanding came from how they viewed heat itself. Most settlers assumed the goal was to heat the air in a cabin. As long as the air closest to the stove felt warm, they believed they were doing things correctly. But in a drafty structure, warm air escaped quickly, replaced by cold currents that sucked heat away faster than any iron stove could produce it. Elias's idea challenged that entire approach. He wasn't trying to warm the air, he was trying to warm the walls, turning them into a slow-release heat reservoir. The clay mix he applied wasn't decorative. It was a material chosen specifically to hold thermal energy, something the Austrian mason had demonstrated to him decades earlier. Every time Elias pressed a new layer onto the logs, he remembered the European cottages that stayed warm long after flames died down. He wasn't recreating those systems completely, not with frontier tools and limited supplies, but he was adapting the principles to the American wilderness. His wall trick, as neighbors mockingly called it, was simply a scaled-down version of old-world masonry heating. But from the outside, all people saw was a man plastering mud where no mud had business being. They teased him when they passed. They warned him it would crumble. They joked he'd freeze first come December. Elias ignored it all. He'd lived through enough mountain winters to know the wind would have the final word. And when that wind came roaring down the valley in November, every man who laughed at him would find out just how wrong they were. By early October, when the first thin crusts of frost began forming on water buckets left outside overnight, Elias started inspecting his cabin the way a surveyor inspects a bridge. He wasn't looking for the obvious flaws. Everyone could see a loose log or a sagging roof beam. Elias was looking for something most settlers never thought about, where the heat would escape. He carried a small candle around the interior late at night, holding it near the floorboards, and then up along the log seams, and then around the window frame. Wherever the flame flickered, he made a mark. The results didn't surprise him. Draft paths ran through the cabin like invisible tunnels. Cold air would funnel underneath the raised floor slip between poorly fitted logs, creep around the door frame, and even slide down the chimney pipe when wind hit from the wrong direction. Most men on the frontier called these drafts just part of cabin life. But Elias knew better. On the coldest nights, moving air didn't just chill a room, it devoured heat. A fire that could keep a snug cabin warm might barely make a dent in one with leaking floors and unsealed gaps. He next checked the floor, and this was where he found the biggest vulnerability. The stick floor sat on spaced joists, with open air circulating freely underneath. That air in winter would be nearly as cold as the outdoor temperature. The thin plank floor offered almost no barrier, and Elias knew it would pull warmth right out of the cabin like a wick. Standing barefoot on it for 10 seconds was enough to understand the problem. The walls were no better. Logs alone had decent insulation, but only when fitted tightly and sealed properly. Most frontier cabins, including his own before the clay work, had gaps that were never fully closed. Traditional mud and moss chinking dried out, shrank, and fell away with freeze-thaw cycles. Even a half-inch crack could act like a miniature chimney, sucking warm air out and funneling cold air in. Then there was the iron stove. The settlers loved them because they produced strong, immediate heat. But Elias already knew the downside: iron had almost no heat storage. Once the fire died, the warmth vanished. The cabin temperature could drop 20 degrees in an hour faster if the wind picked up, and the stove created hot and cold zones, blistering heat near the firebox, freezing corners on the opposite side. What Elias realized was simple. The cold itself wasn't the enemy. The real threat was how quickly a poorly built cabin lost every bit of heat it received. The structure wasn't just failing to stay warm, it was actively pulling warmth out of the air with every draft, every gap, every square foot of exposed wood. Most settlers tried to fight cold by burning more wood. Elias understood that wouldn't solve anything. You couldn't outrun heat loss with more BTUs. You had to address the structure itself. And so he began planning improvements, not based on guesswork, but on what the wind, the candle, and the walls had already shown him. When most settlers talked about keeping a cabin warm, they thought in terms of fuel: more firewood, bigger fires, hotter flames. Very few thought about the materials surrounding them. Wood was the default choice because it was everywhere, easy to work with, and familiar. But familiarity didn't make it the best option for managing heat. Elias Turner understood something his neighbors didn't: the difference between insulation and thermal mass. Wood is a decent insulator, meaning it slows the transfer of heat. But it cannot store heat. Once the fire goes out, a wooden wall cools, rapidly losing whatever warmth it gained in minutes. Clay, on the other hand, behaves very differently. It heats up slowly, but once warmed, it holds that heat for hours, sometimes all night. In Austrian and Eastern European homes, clay-plastered walls and masonry stoves were common not because of tradition, but because they worked with predictable efficiency. Elias had seen it firsthand. In Pennsylvania, the Austrian mason Johann Weiss showed him how a properly mixed clay wall could even out temperature swings inside a home. A small fire would raise the interior temperature, and the clay would absorb a portion of that heat instead of letting it dissipate. Hours later, long after the flames died down, the walls would radiate stored warmth back into the room. It wasn't magic. It was physics, basic, dependable, and proven for centuries. On the American frontier, however, this knowledge never caught on. Clay was seen as a material for temporary structures, pottery, or crude chinking. Few settlers understood its potential as a heat management tool. They were in too much of a rush, and anything that required extra time or extra effort was dismissed as impractical. But in the high Rockies, where winter could kill a man in his sleep, the extra work often made the difference. Elias knew that clay wasn't simply a patching material. It was a heat reservoir. When paired with even a small source of heat, whether an iron stove or a cooking fire, it absorbed energy during the heating period and released it slowly afterward. That slow release effect could keep a cabin stable through the coldest part of the night, even when the fire died down. But clay had other advantages too. When mixed with sand and fiber, it created an airtight seal that eliminated drafts more effectively than wood putty or moss. It also regulated indoor humidity, absorbing moisture when the air was damp and releasing it when conditions dried out. In mountain environments where dampness could rot wood or cause respiratory problems, this was no small benefit. To the neighbors, Elias's clay work still looked like a strange European habit. But to him, it was a calculated decision based on material performance. Clay didn't burn crack under normal heat or shrink in the cold the way moss-based chinking did. It was predictable, and predictability mattered more than opinions. Elias wasn't trying to reinvent frontier building. He was simply applying proven principles from the old world to a landscape that desperately needed them. Once, Elias Turner confirmed where heat was escaping and how quickly the cabin lost warmth. He began building what would become his signature modification, the 5-layer wall system. It wasn't something he copied directly from European homes. Instead, it was a practical adaptation of what he remembered adjusted for the materials he had in the Wind River Valley. Nothing about it was fancy, but every choice had a clear purpose. Layer 1, deep chinking seal. The first step was to rebuild the chinking between the logs. Instead of the usual mud and moss mix that dried, cracked, and fell out by January, Elias made a heavier blend: clay, fine sand, chopped grass, and a small amount of wood ash. The ash helped the mixture cure harder and resist shrinking. He packed it deep into every gap, far deeper than the shallow filling used in most cabins, making sure no air pockets remained. This alone reduced drafts by half. Layer 2, the mass layer. Once the gaps were sealed, he coated the entire interior wall surface with a thin, even layer of clay, about ½ an inch thick. This layer wasn't meant to insulate. Its purpose was density. The added mass allowed the walls to absorb more heat during stove operation, smoothing out temperature swings inside the cabin. Layer 3, capillary stop. To prevent moisture from being pulled into the clay, Elias added a skim coat made from a slightly different mixture: higher sand content, less water, and no grass fibers. This layer acted as a capillary break, stopping moisture transfer through the wall. Without it, the clay could soften or crumble after repeated freeze-thaw cycles. Layer 4, the heat storage coat. This was the heart of the system. Elias mixed a thicker clay compound, nearly 1 inch thick, when applied, designed to store as much heat as possible. He tested mixtures on scrap boards, firing small samples near the stove to see which blend held warmth the longest. The winning mixture used coarse sand and longer grass fibers. Once applied across the entire wall, it created a slow-release heat surface that warmed the cabin evenly for hours after the fire died. Layer 5. Stone footers. At the base of each wall, Elias placed a row of flat field stones partially embedded into the lower clay layers. These stones acted as a heat sink, absorbing radiant warmth from the stove and distributing it through the lower sections of the wall. They also protected the clay from kicks, tool bumps, and general wear during daily cabin life. When finished, the interior no longer looked like a typical log cabin. The walls had a smooth, uniform surface, not elegant, but solid. The neighbors saw mud walls. Elias saw a controlled thermal system built from materials available within walking distance. The entire process took him 9 days of steady work. But when he stepped back and ran his hand across the hardened surface, he knew one thing with absolute certainty: this wall system would behave very differently once winter came. Frontier settlers didn't talk about thermal mass or heat retention. They talked about how hot the stove felt or how fast the fire caught. Their understanding of warmth came from immediate sensation, not long-term performance. Elias Turner's system didn't rely on instinct or guesswork. It relied on basic physics, whether anyone called it that or not. The first principle was simple: wood heats up fast and cools down fast. Logs have low thermal mass, meaning they don't hold on to heat. If the fire dies at midnight, the log walls lose temperature almost immediately. You wake up at 3 a.m. freezing, even if the room was comfortable earlier. Clay and stone behave differently. They warm up slowly, but once heated, they stay warm for hours. This is the same reason a stone hearth can stay warm until morning, or why oven bricks remain hot long after the embers burn out. That slow release of stored heat is exactly what a mountain cabin needs in the hours between fires. The second principle: radiant heat versus heated air. Iron stoves work by heating the air around them. The problem is that heated air rises, moves leaks out, or gets replaced by drafts from below the floor or through cracks in the walls. Every time air escapes, the heat escapes with it. Elias's clay walls didn't rely on heated air. They absorbed radiant heat from the stove directly and returned that heat gradually to the room. Third, eliminating cold surfaces reduces condensation and moisture loss. In most cabins, the log walls became so cold that moisture from cooking, breathing, or wet clothing condensed on them and froze. That ice layer made the cabin feel even colder and robbed more heat from the air. Elias's clay-coated walls warmed just enough to prevent freezing surfaces. The cabin stayed drier, cleaner, and healthier. Fourth, temperature stability equals less fuel consumption. When a cabin has huge temperature swings, hot near the stove, freezing in the corners, you burn more wood trying to chase comfort. A stable cabin, even if slightly cooler by the stove, wastes far less fuel. Elias's walls kept the temperature differences small. No corner of the cabin dropped below freezing once the system was fully warmed. Fifth, draft resistance. Clay layers sealed microscopic gaps that wooden putty and moss never could. Even the best-built log walls still had tiny passages where air moved freely. Those tiny drafts weren't noticeable until the temperature dropped severely, but by then it was too late. Elias's clay skins acted like a continuous membrane, blocking nearly all air movement through the logs. To the neighbors, the warmth in Elias's cabin looked like luck. To Elias, it was the direct result of materials doing exactly what he knew they would do. He wasn't proving a theory. He was applying proven thermal behavior used for centuries in cold climates. And the first time he fired the stove after finishing the work, the performance left no doubt: the walls absorbed and released heat exactly as he intended. The cabin no longer behaved like a wooden box. It behaved like a heat storage structure. Elias waited until the clay had fully cured before testing the cabin under real conditions. By early November, a cold front rolled in from the northwest, dropping the nighttime temperature to around 10 degrees. It was the perfect moment. He lit a moderate fire in the iron stove just after sundown. Nothing extreme, just enough to warm a normal cabin for a couple of hours. He didn't stack extra wood, didn't overfire the stove, and didn't burn the expensive hardwood he saved for deep winter. He wanted a fair test. For the first hour, everything felt ordinary. The air near the stove warmed quickly as expected, and the rest of the cabin remained cool. But Elias noticed something different in the second hour. Instead of cooling the moment the fire slowed, the cabin temperature held steady. He ran his hand across the walls. The clay surface felt surprisingly warm. Not hot, but warm enough that you could feel stored heat beneath your palm. This was the effect he'd been counting on. By the third hour, the fire had burned down to coals. In a typical frontier cabin, this was when the cold crept back in and blankets piled up. Instead, the air stayed consistent, and the walls gave off a faint, steady warmth. The room didn't swing sharply between hot and cold like it usually did with an iron stove. The temperature remained even and predictable. Elias sat on his bunk, built against one of the newly treated walls, and noticed something else. The bed no longer felt like a block of ice. Normally, the wooden frame and mattress stuffing were freezing by late evening, requiring layers of quilts or even heated stones to avoid waking up chilled. But with the clay walls storing heat behind him, the bed held a mild, comfortable temperature. Nothing fancy, just a noticeable difference that made sleeping easier. Around midnight, Elias stepped outside to check the exterior. The stars were out, and frost coated everything within sight. The wind carried a sharp edge, the kind that could cut through layers of wool. He glanced up at his chimney. Almost no smoke. Just a faint shimmer of heat. This told him the system was burning clean and running efficiently. Any neighbor walking by would have assumed he had barely used his stove at all. Inside, he sat by the dying coals and watched the cabin's temperature remain steady. He measured it with a small thermometer he carried, simple, reliable, and invaluable on the frontier. The cabin held about 18 degrees warmer than the outside air hours after the fire had died down. By dawn, it was still 12 degrees warmer inside than it would have been in a conventional cabin with the fire out. When he woke the next morning, the feeling was clear and undeniable. He hadn't shivered once during the night. He hadn't burned extra fuel, and he hadn't needed to restart the fire before sunrise. The cabin had held its warmth. His 5-layer wall trick had worked exactly as he hoped. The real test arrived sooner than anyone expected. In late December, a severe Arctic front swept down from Montana and stalled over the Wind River Valley for nearly a week. Temperatures dropped below zero on the first night and kept falling. By the third night, the valley sat under -20 degrees, with steady wind cutting through every crack in every cabin. Snow piled up so quickly that several families had to dig their way out each morning just to reach their wood piles. In cabins built the usual way, the cold took over fast. Floors felt like blocks of ice. Frost formed on interior walls before midnight. Bedding never fully dried because every breath turned to moisture and froze. Most settlers kept their stove burning nonstop, feeding it pine, aspen, broken fence posts, even scrap lumber. Some families slept sitting up in chairs, keeping watch on the fire, because letting it die was unthinkable. You either fed the stove or you froze. But Elias Turner's cabin behaved very differently. Each evening he loaded the stove just once, with a modest amount of hardwood. Nothing excessive. No emergency overfiring. He let the fire run hot for an hour or two, then allowed it to burn down naturally to coals. After that, he put on his coat, stepped outside, and closed the door for the night. No tending, no relighting, no waking up every 2 hours to add more wood. Inside, the clay-coated walls absorbed the early heat, then released it slowly through the night. Even when the outside temperature hit 20 below, the interior walls stayed in the 40 to 50 degree range. That alone made a dramatic difference. With no cold surfaces pulling warmth from the room, the cabin air stayed stable and comfortable. His floor, insulated earlier that fall with birch bark and packed grasses, remained warm enough to walk on in socks. Bedding stayed dry. There were no frozen blankets, no frost crawling across the inner logs, no need to thaw water in the morning. Elias kept a bucket 3 feet from the stove, and unlike every other cabin in the valley, it never formed a layer of ice. By the 4th night of the cold snap, word had spread. Neighbors began checking on one another, but many detoured past Elias's cabin just to see if the stories were true. They expected to find him huddled by a roaring stove. Instead, they saw a quiet room, a soft glow from the coals, and a steady warmth that didn't match the brutal temperature outside. Elias didn't brag. He didn't lecture. He simply explained that the walls were doing their job. The heat wasn't disappearing the moment the fire died. It was being held and returned. For the first time, men who had mocked his clay walls now stood silent, rubbing their hands along the warm surface, then shaking their heads at how wrong they'd been. The blizzard didn't just test the valley. It proved without question that Elias Turner's strange wall trick worked better than anything the frontier had trusted before. When the cold finally lifted in early January, the entire valley looked worn down. Wood piles that should have lasted until March were nearly gone. Several families had burned furniture tool handles, even sections of old fencing, just to stay alive. People were exhausted from weeks of night-long fire tending. But one cabin looked almost untouched: Elias Turner's. By now everyone knew his place held warmth better than any structure in the area. They had felt it themselves during the worst nights: steady heat, dry bedding, and no icy drafts sweeping across the floor. Word spread from cabin to cabin, and before long neighbors began stopping by, not just to warm up, but to understand what he had done. The first to ask directly was Samuel Curtis. His own cabin had nearly failed during the blizzard. Frost covered the walls. A corner of his roof sagged from ice buildup. His children had slept with their boots on because the floor was painfully cold. Samuel arrived at Elias's door holding a small notebook and simply said, "Show me how you built these walls." Elias wasn't a man who hoarded knowledge. He explained every step plainly: how deep he packed the chinking, why he mixed ash into the clay, how he applied each layer, and why draft control mattered just as much as heat storage. Samuel took notes like a schoolboy. For him, it wasn't about comfort anymore. It was about keeping his family alive next winter. 2 days later, Henrik Larson showed up. His cabin had suffered the worst damage. One roof beam cracked, forcing his family to shelter with neighbors. Henrik was older, proud, and not the type to ask for help. But after standing inside Elias's warm cabin for a few minutes, he quietly admitted, "I built wrong. I want to rebuild right." By mid-February, word reached families farther down the valley. A few ranchers rode several miles just to inspect the unusual clay surface on the walls. One man kept tapping the hardened clay with his knuckles, muttering, "Never thought dirt could do this." The interest didn't stop there. When supply wagons arrived in early spring, they brought news that the story had spread as far as Lander and Fort Washakie. Travelers mentioned a man in the winds who kept his cabin warm with mud walls. Some wanted to learn more. Others sent questions in letters. Even a territorial newspaper printed a short piece about European-style heating experiments performed by mountain settlers. By summer, 3 new cabins in the valley were built using Elias's method, each modified slightly to fit the builder's needs. Some added thicker clay layers. Others used local stone foundations to increase heat retention. all reported dramatic improvements in warmth and fuel savings. Elias never intended to start a movement. He wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong or introduce a new frontier trend. He simply applied what he knew, built what made sense, and let the results speak for themselves. But through one hard winter, one stubborn experiment, and one man willing to work differently, an entire valley changed the way it built and survived the cold. By the time spring arrived, the valley had changed, not because people became more open-minded, but because the winter forced them to. Nobody cared about tradition or habit when their water buckets froze solid 5 feet from a roaring stove. The men who once joked about mud walls now understood something simple. What worked in mild climates or low elevations didn't work in the high Rockies. Frontier builders often copied designs from farms and homesteads back east, assuming a cabin was a cabin no matter where you built it. But the mountains didn't follow those rules. Winters lasted longer. Cold settled deeper. Wind pushed through a wall crack the width of a thumbnail. The environment didn't reward speed or shortcuts. It rewarded whatever kept people warm and alive. That's why Elias Turner's approach mattered. He didn't rely on guesses, old habits, or wishful thinking. He relied on performance. If a material held heat, he used it. If it blocked drafts, he applied it. If it stored warmth longer, he made it part of the structure. He treated the cabin like a system, not just a shelter. And for the first time, the valley saw the results clearly. Families who visited his place during the blizzard remembered walking inside and feeling the temperature difference immediately. There was no thick smoke haze, no ice on the inside logs, no hot and cold pockets around the room. Instead, the heat was even the floor was reasonable to stand on, and the air stayed dry enough to avoid freezing blankets. People understood then that heating wasn't just about burning more wood, it was about reducing heat loss. Elias's cabin proved it. A single evening fire held warmth well into the next afternoon. Meanwhile, other families burned 4 to 10 times more wood just to keep their rooms above freezing. This was a turning point. Instead of building for speed, settlers began building for results. Clay mixes replaced quick mud. Deep chinking replaced superficial stuffing. Some even installed small stone footers or experimented with clay coat walls after seeing how well Elias's system performed. The lesson spread farther than expected. Travelers heading to other settlements shared what they'd seen. A few soldiers at Fort Washakie mentioned it to engineers. Merchants in Lander began stocking clay trowels because customers were suddenly asking for them. The story grew because the winter had given it weight. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a proven method. And the people who once laughed weren't laughing now. They were copying the work. What happened in that valley wasn't about one man being smarter than others. It was about one man being willing to observe, test, and adapt, while everyone else stayed locked into routines that didn't match the environment. In the end, Elias's wall trick didn't just warm a cabin. It shifted how an entire community thought about cold weather building in the Rockies' practical, measurable improvement, replacing decades of bad assumptions. When summer finally settled into the Wind River Valley, the memory of that brutal winter was still fresh in everyone's mind. No one forgot the nights when the cold pushed its way into every cabin, except one. Elias Turner's wall trick, once a joke among neighbors, was now considered one of the most practical improvements the valley had ever seen. By midsummer, several families began rebuilding or modifying their homes. Some tore out old chinking and replaced it with deeper clay-based mixes. Others coated entire interior walls with clay and sand, following the exact method Elias had shown them. A few even experimented with small masonry benches or stone footers to extend heat retention. The results were consistent warmer rooms, fewer drafts, and better fuel efficiency. Visitors who passed through the valley took notice. Hunters, ranchers, and supply wagon drivers often asked, which cabins stayed warm last winter? Everyone pointed toward Elias's place. Some men sketched drawings, others asked for detailed explanations. A few took samples of the clay mix in small tins or cloth pouches so they could try it back home. By the following fall, the idea had spread to nearby settlements. Reports came from Crowheart and Dubois that a couple of cabins were now using similar clay-coated interiors. A trader from South Pass City mentioned hearing about a mountain man who beat the winter with a dirt wall. Even if they didn't know his name, they knew the results: lower fuel use, warmer nights, and healthier living conditions. Elias didn't think of it as a legacy. To him, it was simply building smart, using materials that made sense for the environment. He didn't claim to invent anything. He always credited the Austrian mason Johann Weiss, whose lessons decades earlier had shown him how materials behave under fire and cold. Elias just applied that knowledge to the realities of the Rockies' limited resources, unpredictable weather, and long stretches of isolation where mistakes could be costly. When the next winter arrived, the valley was better prepared. Cabins that had once lost heat within an hour now held steady through the night. Families burned less wood and slept more comfortably. Frost no longer crept down the inside walls. Drafts vanished from the floors. For many, it was the first winter in years where they didn't wake up before dawn to restart the stove. What began as a mocked experiment became a reliable practice. And long after Elias passed on, people in the region continued using the method because it worked. No theory, no guesswork, just a straightforward improvement, grounded in observation and performance. Elias Turner never set out to change how people built in the Rockies. He simply built the way he knew would keep him alive. But sometimes in harsh country, a practical solution is enough to reshape the habits of everyone around you. His clay walls proved one thing clearly: on the frontier, the smallest changes in how you build can make the biggest difference in how you survive.